Hello, I'm Evan. In early 2017, I endeavored to compile a list of every single canonical Doctor Who story. This is obviously pretty daunting, and is especially problematic given that canon is such an incredibly nebulous and difficult to define subject, especially in Doctor Who. Doctor Who, unlike many popular science fiction properties, is a media property that has generally avoided remarking on the canonicity of its many stories, but that doesn't really stop fans from fighting about it, as fans usually do. It is somewhat likely, then, that you, the audience, may have no idea what canon actually means, and so I will attempt to define it for you. The TARDIS Wiki, in its article about canon, says, and I'm editorializing here, in theory, canon is an established body of work that other canonical works draw upon. However, it is more commonly thought to be the works that make up the Doctor Who universe, or the works that, quote-unquote, actually happened within that universe. That's the end quote. So, when a fan asks, is it canonical, when talking about a Doctor Who story, they are asking one of two things. One, did it actually happen in the universe of the show? And or two, is it an officially recognized part of the show? Of course, everyone has their own personal definition of canon, so let's look at these two guidelines and I will explain my own personal viewpoint on both. The first, did it actually happen in the universe of the show, feels like a weird question, given that Doctor Who is a show about time travel that constantly rewrites its own history. It's also a show with multiple universes and individual episodes that contradict its own history many times. So using this question as a guideline for canon doesn't really work for me. The second, is it an officially recognized part of the show, is a deeper and more complicated question. As I've said before, Doctor Who has generally avoided remarking upon canon at all. The only exception to this is the freemium Doctor Who video game, the adventure games, which are literally the only piece of Doctor Who media that has ever been stated by the BBC as canon. But perhaps we could glean what is canon via things the show chooses to say happened or didn't happen. The problem here is, once again, the show is about time travel, multiverses, and so on and so forth. So instead, we're going to switch gears to copyright. In an article on plagiarism today entitled The Strange Copyright of Doctor Who, Jonathan Bailey explains the precarious copyright situation surrounding the show. For most media properties, the entire property is owned by a single entity, whether it be a big corporation or a single author. Doctor Who, however, is in a different position. Bailey says, for much of the show's history, up until roughly the Fifth Doctor, writers often retained copyright in what they created. So while the series, including the lead character and much of the core of the show, is controlled by the BBC, many of the characters, aliens, and concepts that were added early on were not. A notable example are the Daleks, who are partially owned by the nation estate. In media franchises that are wholly owned by a single entity, that single entity usually is the arbiter of canon. This differs from Doctor Who, since many of its iconic parts are not owned by the BBC, and so Doctor Who has no authority on canon, and the closest thing to that authority, the BBC, has no interest in establishing a canon. The second closest authority, then, is copyright itself, and so we will define canon based on ownership and copyright. See, because many characters, aliens, and concepts are owned by different entities, anyone who gets the license to produce fiction with these things can make Doctor Who stories, even if they don't have the rights to the Doctor herself. The very act of writing a licensed story for, say, K9 is a statement on the work's canonicity, even without mentioning the Doctor. And then, any characters, aliens, and concepts featured in those stories become part of Doctor Who canon as well. And then the people with the copyright for those things can license out those rights, and so on and so forth. This, obviously, is just one definition of canon, but it is drawing from the authority we currently have. In addition to this, it's also a definition of canon that encapsulates as many works as it possibly can, which is great for me because it makes compiling a list fun. I could have stopped the definition under just the Doctor Who license, but it's more fun to have a definition expand every time a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off happens. So now, let's go through the formal definition that is on the front page of my list. Number 1. Media officially licensed to be Doctor Who is considered canonical. So this one's self-explanatory. The list is of media, so the definition needs to state what media is canonical. Number 2. All characters and settings from officially licensed Doctor Who are considered canonical. This one seems redundant, but attaching the canonical attribute to concepts that are copyrightable allows us to draw a connection between different media. Number 3. Any media officially licensed to contain canonical characters and settings are considered canonical. This one defines any spin-offs featuring canonical characters as canon. And then number 4. All characters and settings from media officially licensed to contain characters and settings that are canonical are also canonical. This rule creates like a feedback loop, because now, as long as a character has shared a story with another canonical character, they are themselves now canon. It's like a virus. Next up are a couple guidelines for what is excluded from the list. Number 5. Characters and settings excluded from Doctor Who canon are characters and settings from already established franchises or works. This includes Star Trek, Dark Shadows, etc., as well as other fictionalized versions of real and/or historical figures and places. So, technically, according to rules number 1 through 4, all of Star Trek and all of Dark Shadows are canonical in Doctor Who, but this is a list of Doctor Who stories, so we're not putting them in. Secondly, we need a limit on characters and settings that are real. Of course, you can't license real people and locations, but they still exist in universe. Number 6. Characters and settings that are included despite the above rule are specific Doctor Who versions of cultural figures, such as King Arthur, Dorian Gray, or Sherlock Holmes. So, for example, Big Finish has crossed over its own version of Sherlock Holmes with Doctor Who. This does not make all of Sherlock Holmes canon, nor does it make any other officially licensed Sherlock Holmes canon, but it does make that specific adaptation of Sherlock Holmes canon. Number 7. Media included must have a story, but there are no guidelines for complexity. We consider choose-your-own-adventure books stories. So this is a list of stories. This means like a list of facts, even if it's in-universe, is not a story, I guess. By contrast, there is a browser game called The Last Dalek, and the only story is Dalek shoots people, and I guess it's also the last one. And so I would consider that a story, despite its simplicity. Number 8. This is a list of stories. Multiple releases that are part of the same story are combined into one entry. A release containing multiple stories is separated into multiple entries. Story grouping is based on own interpretation. So, this is just a little bit of housekeeping, but we can argue about whether or not Utopia Sound of Drums, Lest of the Time Lords is one story, or whether or not Miracle Day is 10 individual stories. Well, it's fun. That's what we do for fun. Number 9. Audiobooks of print stories are not included. Novelizations are now included, though abridgments, shortened versions, they're not. Video and audio drama adaptations of print stories are included. So, adaptations include new content, while audiobooks are almost exactly the print, so they're excluded, especially for sanity's sake. And number 10. For sanity's sake, discretion will be exercised in gray areas for the above rules. So, I worked very hard to make these comprehensive, but sometimes stuff slips through the cracks. With these guidelines, I went about compiling the list. My main resource was the TARDIS wiki, and it became very obvious that Doctor Who media was divided into a couple distinct categories. I chose to categorize them as such: television and film, other video, Big Finish audios, other audio, Titan Comics, comics and magazines, BBC and Virgin Books, other prose, and miscellaneous. Most of the time I would use the TARDIS wiki as a starting point, but often, especially for the spin-offs of spin-offs of spin-offs that I wanted, they would not be covered on the wiki, and so I would have to search for them myself. The initial process took about 2 months, and all of the items were manually inputted. Eventually, an update would be made in early 2018, and I unveiled it to the world. Here it is, give or take a couple 5,000 entries. Currently, there are about 6,190 individual stories on the list, but I know there are at least a couple hundred or more that I'm considering. The list is intended to allow you different ways to sort and filter the data. For example, you are easily able to see the entire chronology of canonical releases from the very beginning to even the distant future. You can filter to see how many stories exist for each Doctor or how many multi-Doctor stories exist. There's also an option to completely randomize the list. Take a look and download the list yourself. It's on my Twitter's pinned tweet, or you can click on the incredibly long URL in the description. I hope you take a look. I spent a lot of hard work on it. Thank you.